Hi everyone, and welcome back to the N Burton Academy for the next explainer video. A slight interesting twist today, following some feedback, or some really positive feedback rather, from a X live stream that we did earlier today. I decided to make a slightly more condensed and shorter video to upload to the YouTube channel to help give you guys the best possible understanding of what was a really important topic, and that was about how, with everything that's been going on in the world with respect to oil prices, we might start to see changes in what we call monetary policy that ultimately impact on the cash that's in your pocket. So, by way of a bit of an explainer then, for me personally, just delivering a YouTube channel, a blog, an article about personal finance is clearly really important for lots of people for so many different reasons. And as a lot of what we do demonstrates, sometimes that involves getting into the really nitty gritty and talking about how individual products work, whether this credit card works, or how to move your debt from here to here, basics of investing, what about my personal circumstances with respect to student finance, and so on. But actually, sometimes it's about zooming out, stepping back, and talking about some of the big, what we call macro issues. And because ultimately, that impacts on how everything else works around it, and ultimately how the money in your pocket behaves. It won't be lost on anyone that's been to the petrol pumps in recent weeks that the price of oil has gone through the roof. And clearly the vast majority of that, if not all of it, has been caused by the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, particularly with respect to the war in Iran. Now, the reason that that's had such a knock-on effect as far as oil prices are concerned is because the war has essentially shut off an international shipping lane known as the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the reason that's really important is because that essentially allows around 20% of the world's oil and natural gas supplies to flow through it and to supply everything that we recognise as part of our economy. So oil for fueling your car, distribution, manufacturing, loads of other bits and pieces that all come together to make the economy function in the way that it does. We couldn't do it without oil, like it or not. And that's not me getting on a high horse to say that we must do fossil fuels, we must go for a more green agenda. That's just a reflection of the reality today. Right now, we need oil. And the war in Iran has curtailed those supplies by quite a significant amount. Like I say, somewhere in the region of about 20% of the world's oil and natural gas supplies have been constrained because of the conflict. What that does is it creates pressure on prices. And again, when we talk about economics, and I'm being very simplistic here, but broadly speaking, we have two forms of inflationary pressure. Two forms of what ultimately drives the prices of something up. Number one, demand pull. Lots of people want to buy it, but there's perhaps more demand than there is supply. Prices go up. For example, try and book a hotel or something like that, or a flight to a World Cup destination, which will happen in a few months' time, and you'll find that actually there aren't very many of them that are available, and the ones that are available are significantly more expensive than perhaps they were at a different time. Lots of people want it, less supply. The next one's a little bit more complicated, and ultimately the price moves up in this area because the cost that comes with the production of whatever asset it is, which in this case oil and gas, has gone up. We've removed quite a significant amount of supply. We've disrupted the supply chain, and that ultimately means that there's just less to go around, and therefore the costs of it rise. Now, I'm not here to wade in on the debate about whether that's right or wrong, or whether we should or shouldn't be doing that. That's just the reality of the world that we face today. But that creates something called inflationary pressure. And as you may already know, inflationary pressure is all around how quickly the prices of everyday items rise, in the most simplistic terms. To keep inflation managed at a sensible level, in the UK at least, it's the job of the Bank of England to control something called an interest rate. So in the case that inflation is running too high because lots of people are going out spending, driving up prices and all that good stuff, the Bank of England's method of controlling interest rates is controlling inflation is to control the interest rate and to move the interest rate either up or down depending on whether we want to put money in or money out of the economy. So if prices were really, really high, traditionally the bank would raise that rate, and over a period of months, what that does is it really crudely takes money away from you and I that we would have spent in shops, restaurants, whatever, because the cost of borrowing, usually for people's mortgages, that's the main driver, pumps their mortgage prices up, and over time they have less and less disposable income as people remortgage to get higher rates. Anyone that bought a house or got a mortgage deal in around 2021 and is coming towards the end of a 5-year fix will really be feeling that right now as they come to remortgage, because the interest rates are just so much higher than what they were back then. And you deheat the economy over a period of time because we're taking that money out of the system. And although it perhaps has consequences that are unpleasant for you and I as the consumer, from a big picture perspective, it works. Now, the issue you have with the Iran conflict and the oil and gas issues that we're seeing today is that the only medicine we have in the cabinet, interest rates, doesn't necessarily cure the problem of inflation, or if it does, it creates unintended consequences elsewhere. Let me explain some more. So, we've already established that oil is essential in our economy. We've already established that you need it. It's an essential to put petrol in your car to get to work, and lots of other businesses need it to keep their business moving as well. Which ultimately means that if the price goes up and up and up, things like the cost of food and other basic goods and services will increase as well, because a lot of businesses, they operate on a really tight margin and they don't have the ability to absorb those cost increases beyond a certain point. So the costs of the goods have gone up, but we've already established that this is essential. So people will cut around where they can to try and make some savings in their budget, but the reality is it only gets you so far. And for a lot of people, what that will ultimately mean is they've cut everything out of their budget as much as they can. The costs are still high, but they need to find a way to meet that cost. So the only option they've got left, because they've probably already exhausted all of their savings and investments if they have any, is to turn to borrowing. And that's not because they want to be irresponsible, usually quite the opposite. They're turning there because of necessity, because they still need to get to work, because they still need to buy shopping or whatever it is that they need to do that is essential. Clues in the name, essential. But we've upped the rates of interest, haven't we, as a way of trying to cool this inflation. And therefore what's probably actually happening is, yes, it is creating a little bit of deflationary pressure because some people will be able to absorb that increased borrowing cost to an extent on their mortgages. Some people will have that headroom, but a lot of other people won't. But what you now have is a situation where people have less money in their pocket, they've exhausted their savings, their essentials have already gone up, and their now only option to make ends meet is to take on debt. Consumer debt, credit cards, overdrafts, loans, all that stuff that really people would try to avoid where they could. But the catch, it's now more expensive. And it's now more expensive because the interest rates are higher. So yes, over time, that will cool inflation. The reality, interest rates will probably do a little bit. The real driver that cools that inflationary pressure will be stabilisation in the oil and gas market. And I think anyone that tells you differently is probably kidding themselves to a greater or lesser extent that anything other than that will fix the problem. Or we develop some other alternative source of fuel and energy very, very quickly. But as a result of that, we've now got this really long tail of lots of households who were squeezed because the cost of essentials went up. They were squeezed because the cost of borrowing went up, And ultimately that swallowed up all that was left of their budget, and they've now got some really expensive consumer debt that they never wanted to take on in the first place, all because they had to find a way to make ends meet. So yes, even something like shipping problems in the Middle East can have massive knock-on consequences to everyone in the UK and further afield, weeks, months, and even further down the line. It will create inflationary pressure, but we only have a very limited means of disposing of that inflationary pressure through the management of interest rates. And for every one problem it fixes, it creates another through household debt, and ultimately creates a situation where people, through no fault of their own, have to borrow even more at a higher rate just to get by. I hope you found that a useful, if slightly sobering video about the relationship between things like oil and gas, interest and inflation. For me, it's really important at joining those dots between what's going on a global scale right the way down to how individual people, products and services behave. We need to understand that relationship, because it's only when we understand what's going on up here on a big picture level, and we understand down here how individual products work, can we draw that golden thread that gives us the level of understanding that we need to make the best possible financial decisions for you and your family. Thanks very much for taking the time to listen to the video. Please like, subscribe and share to get this out to as many people as possible so that they too can make better financial decisions.